would go to an Indian ruler and force him to dissolve his own army. In return, the EIC would protect him with their troops, for a massive fee, of course. The ruler lost his independence, and when he inevitably couldn't make the huge payments, the company would just seize his kingdom as compensation. It was conquest disguised as a business deal. And using this playbook, state by state, kingdom by kingdom, the company's power just grew exponentially. Within just a few decades... Hello and welcome everyone to History Shots. We're about to dive into a story that honestly sounds like it's straight out of science fiction. It's the story of how a single company, a corporation run from a tiny office in London, managed to take over an entire subcontinent. Not with the government's army, but with its own. Just look at these numbers for a second. On one side, you have the mighty Mughal Empire. We're talking a global superpower of its time, with an army of 4 million soldiers. And on the other side, the East India Company. It started out as just a regular company with a few hundred merchants and investors. The mismatch here is just staggering. So that's the big question, right? How on earth did this commercial enterprise, this business, manage to bring one of the world's most powerful empires to its knees? The answer isn't some big single war. No, it's a story of 100 years of patient, political, and absolutely ruthless maneuvering. Stay with us as we unpack how it all went down. But here's the crazy part. Their story of conquest doesn't start with some glorious victory, not even close. It actually begins with a massive, arrogant mistake that almost got them kicked out of India for good. So, in 1686, the company got a little too big for its britches. They were making good money, and they thought they could flex their muscle. So they declared war on the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. And, well, it was an absolute disaster. Their tiny private army was just completely crushed by the imperial forces. It was a very hard, very humbling lesson for them. The fallout was a total humiliation. I mean, their factories were seized, their top officials were arrested, and the company's governor was literally forced to grovel before the emperor and beg for forgiveness. And the price for their little adventure? A huge fine just for the privilege of being allowed to trade again. So, how do you go from that level of embarrassing defeat to total domination? To figure that out, we actually have to rewind the clock a bit, back to the company's much more humble and, frankly, much smarter beginnings. You see, after that humiliating defeat, the company learned its lesson. They went back to their original strategy. When they first arrived back in 1608, they didn't show up with soldiers. They showed up with diplomats. A guy named Sir Thomas Roe spent years at the Mughal court, not making demands, but persuading, giving these lavish gifts to Emperor Jahangir. And it worked. His diplomacy won them the trading rights they so desperately wanted. They were playing the long game. But then, in 1670, everything changed. Back in England, King Charles II gave the company a new charter with these unbelievable new powers. Suddenly, they could mint their own money, they could create their own laws, and this is the absolute game changer. They could acquire territory, raise a private army, and wage war. Just like that, a trading company was given all the powers of a nation-state. So now the company had the power, but they still didn't really have the opportunity to use it. But they were patient. And in the early 1700s, the perfect storm that they had been waiting for finally arrived. That storm hit in 1707 with the death of Emperor Aurangzeb. Yep, the same emperor who had humiliated them all those years ago. Without his strong hand, the empire just began to fracture. Princes fought each other for the throne. Powerful governors started declaring their independence, and invaders swept in from the outside. India went from being a unified empire to this chaotic patchwork of competing kingdoms. And right in the middle of all this chaos, the new weakened Mughal emperor gave the company something called a Dastak in 1717. Think of this as a golden ticket. It let the company trade in the incredibly rich province of Bengal without paying a single rupee in taxes. Now, this not only gave them a huge advantage over their rivals, but it also made the local ruler of Bengal furious because his treasury was being drained. And right there, the seeds of conflict were sown. And this is the moment the East India Company shifts from being just opportunistic traders to calculated conquerors. They decided to stop asking for permission and start taking control. And they started with Bengal. The first real test of this new aggressive strategy was the Battle of Plassey in 1757. I mean, if you just look at the army sizes, it should have been an impossible fight for the company. But the EIC's commander, Robert Clive, he wasn't planning to win with bullets. He won with bribery. He made a secret backroom deal with the Nab's own top commander, a man named Mir Jafar, promising to make him the new ruler. So when the battle started, a huge chunk of the Nab's army just stood there and did nothing, handing a shocking victory to the company. For a few years, the company ruled through these puppet leaders they installed. But pretty soon, they just got tired of pulling the strings from behind the curtain. So in 1765, they forced the Mughal emperor to grant them the Diwani of Bengal. This was the ultimate prize, the right to collect all the taxes from the entire region. The company's business wasn't just spices anymore, it was governance. They were now the rulers, and they were funding their entire operation with India's own wealth. With Bengal in their pocket, the company perfected this brutally effective playbook for taking over the rest of India. And this was their real innovation. They realized they didn't need to fight expensive wars for every piece of land. They could take over the whole subcontinent through this slow, systematic process of political meddling and financial traps. Now, the heart of this playbook was something called the subsidiary alliance. It was a brilliant and truly sinister trap. The company would go to an Indian ruler and force him to dissolve his own army. In return, the EIC would protect him with their troops, for a massive fee, of course. The ruler lost his independence, and when he inevitably couldn't make the huge payments, the company would just seize his kingdom as compensation. It was conquest disguised as a business deal. And using this playbook, state by state, kingdom by kingdom, the company's power just grew exponentially. Within just a few decades, what started as a couple of small trading posts on the coast had become a vast, continent-spanning empire, all run for profit. So just how successful was this strategy? Well, by 1818, that's less than 60 years after they took Bengal, this one private company ruled over 78% of the entire Indian population. Just let that sink in for a moment. A corporation based in London was governing the lives of nearly 4 out of every 5 people on the subcontinent. The final tool in their playbook was maybe the most cynical of all, the doctrine of lapse. This was a new rule they made up that said if any allied Indian ruler died without a direct male heir, his kingdom would just be absorbed by the company. Ancient royal lines were wiped out with the stroke of a pen, and kingdoms like Jhansi and Awadh were annexed one after another, sparking absolute outrage across India. And all that resentment finally boiled over and exploded in the massive revolt of 1857. Now, even though the rebellion was eventually crushed, it terrified the British government back in London. They decided the East India Company had become too powerful, too dangerous. So, in 1858, the British Crown officially dissolved the company and took direct control of India. That was the end of company rule and the beginning of the British Raj. And so the company's incredible story comes to an end. But its legacy is a pretty chilling one. A private corporation driven by the search for profit that became an imperial power. And it really does leave us with a question for our own time. In an age where some corporations are wealthier and more powerful than entire nations, could something like this ever happen again? If you want to keep exploring the incredible stories that shaped our world, make sure you subscribe. We'll see you next time.